And so it's my great pleasure to introduce to you the Reverend Michael Blair, who has held several posts at the General Council Office of the United Church over the past decade. He's currently the Executive Minister of the Church in Mission Unit, and previously was the Executive Minister for Ethnic Ministries, and before that, Executive Minister of Communities in Ministry. There's been a lot of changes in the United Church, so job titles have changed. Represents the United Church at the World Council of Churches on a commission on mission and evangelism. And for those who follow him on Instagram, they will see quickly that he is a very skilled photographer in his free time. Michael resides in Toronto, where he has for a number of years, with his partner Dawn, and has 2 adult children. And I invite you to welcome him.
Thanks, Beth. Good morning. It's my privilege to be with you this morning. Just a shameless plug. I have a son who is a comedian, and if you're a CBC watcher and you've seen the series Tall Boys, my son is one of the actors in that. It's been fascinating for me to no longer have my own identity. I'm known as Tim's dad. So I'm Tim's dad to those of you who have watched Tall Boys. I'd invite you to just pray with me as we begin this morning. Holy One, we gather in this place and we pray that you may help to reshape our imagination. May the words of my mouth and the meditation of our hearts together find their full acceptance before you. In the name of Jesus. A few words from what is commonly known as the Black National Anthem. One of the stanzas begins, "Stony the road we trod, quickening the chastened rod, felt in the days when hope unborn had died." This past week, with all the challenges and issues that we have experienced in the world, the downing of the Iranian flight, the threat of war with Iran, the earthquake and the death in Puerto Rico, the unrelenting fires in Australia, and on it goes. It feels like a moment in which hope unborn has died. And the challenge for those of us who claim to be followers of the way of Jesus, the challenge for us is, how then do we live? In the context of a world, in the context of a space and time when it just seems like everything seems hopeless. That nothing seems to, and especially in the context of coming out of the period of Christmas with all the kind of anticipation of the hope of the coming of this Christ child and this Christ child's ability to bring healing and wholeness to the world. In light of the season of Epiphany that has begun, where we think about light and sight and new insights, how then do we live in the context of a place, context of a time when it feels like hope has died? And I'm challenged by that same stanza in that song from Lift Every Voice and Sing, which is the Black National Anthem. Because on the heels of saying, in the days where hope unborn had died, you have this notion, yet with a steady beat. There is this movement that happens in the midst of feeling hopeless. The words of the song, which speaks of the experience of enslaved people, says, yet with a steady beat, have not our weary feet moved to the place for which our fathers sighed. And so the question for us this morning is then, how then do we move? And as I've thought about that and thought about the context of the Isaiah text which was read to you, I was also challenged by the words of Howard Thurman. And you may know these words, but Thurman says, when the songs of the angels is stilled, when the star in the sky is gone, when the kings and princes are home, when the shepherds are back within their fields, the work of Christmas begins. To find the lost, to heal the broken, to feed the hungry, to release the prisoner, to rebuild the nations, to bring peace among others, and make music in the heart. Howard Thurman reminds us, in the same way the song of enslaved people remind us, that in the midst of a context where there seems to be no hope, that we're called to move forward. And we're called to move forward in a way that, as the end of that text that was read to us from Isaiah 55, we are repairers of the walls and restorers of street to live in. So Isaiah reminds us, in the same way that at the start of the ministry of Jesus, as Jesus begins his ministry in Luke, Jesus alludes to similar themes as he reads from Isaiah 61. Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he's anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor, to set at liberty those who are bound, the recovery of sight to the blind, to proclaim the year of God's favor, the year of Jubilee. And Isaiah reminds us that what we are about as a people of God in the midst of a time of discouragement and disheartenment is that we are about restoring breaches and creating spaces for people to live. So Isaiah reminds us of a couple of things. First thing that Isaiah reminds us of in the text is that our work of social engagement is not something we do from a place of abundance. It is not something we do because somehow we have arrived and the others haven't. Our engagement is rooted in the fact that it's an expression of our commitment. It's a part of our worship. Our social action, our care for the poor, the hungry, the naked, is not something that comes out of a place of abundance, but it comes out of a rootedness in our faith. That the act of worship that we are invited to do is an act that is meaningless unless it's impact the lives of those who experience exclusion, lack of food, lack of home, lack of clothing. Is this not the fast, Isaiah reminds us, that God calls us to? Is not this the act that God calls us to? To take care of the oppressed. That is part of what we as the people of God are called to engage in. and it's a part of our worship, the expression of our worship. It's not an add-on. It's not a privilege. It's an integral part of what it means to worship God. And Isaiah reminds us of that. But Isaiah reminds us, and this is the thing I want to just kind of encourage us about this morning, that the ultimate task of our engagement in the work of Christmas is to be repairers of the breach and restorers of streets to walk in. And it must take a generational approach. Much of our justice work, much of our engagement in dealing with people who are without food, food banks are great and a necessity. Most of it is focused around the immediacy and not the long term. Isaiah reminds us that it's a rebuilding for generation in the text. That it's going to be a rebuilding for generation. And we must take a long-term perspective, and we must, Isaiah reminds us, take a communal perspective because it's about repairing the beach and restoring the streets for people to live in. It's not a one-off. It's not an individual thing. We need to take into consideration the whole, the well-being. If you think about it, the notion of rebuilding the breach is that the city walls were important. They were places of safety. And if the walls created the safe space, the community that lived within that had much space to move around and be free and to experience all the privileges. And so our work is a work that's about rebuilding communities. It is not just about lifting up individuals. It is about communities. And as a work about communities, we need to think in terms of the whole, not just the individuals. So Isaiah reminds us that if we share what we have with the poor, take care of the hungry, we will call on God and God will answer. And in that answer, God allows us to be people who are repairers of the breach and restorers of city to live in. Let me share with you a couple of stories. Stephen Solomon is a professor at Jakarta Theological College in Indonesia. For 20 years, Stephen Solomon has offered to his seminary students a course on LBGT inclusion. For 20 years, every year he offers the course. And every year his students, as part of their field placement, have to work in an area or context where LBGT folks are involved. For 20 years, he has not seen fruit, as it were, to his labors. 3 years ago, the first student came out in the seminary. And since then, a number of students have come out. But here's what's happened. 10% of the population in Indonesia are Christian. 24 million people associated with the Christian church in Indonesia. A few years ago, the government in Indonesia wanted to pass a law that would be very oppressive to LBGT folks. And the Council of Churches in Indonesia wrote a letter to the government saying, hands off, you can't do that. What happened was Stephen's work bore fruit. because all the heads of churches that were part of the Council of Churches were Stephen's student. And so when this issue came up, because of all the work that Stephen had done, they were able to say to the government, hands off. Today in Jakarta, there is the first congregation that is open and affirming. And to my big surprise, it's a Baptist. And in typical Baptist fashion, the congregation was kicked out of the Baptist church. Today, Muslims and Christians have formed a coalition for support of LBGT folks because Stephen understood that the call was not a call to individual benefit, but was a call for community benefit. And his investment has created the space where LBGT folks can walk the streets safely. Friends, Isaiah reminds us that what we are called to do is on a communal level, not just on an individual level. And we have to think communally. Carolyn Acker was the executive director of Regent Park Community Health Center in Regent Park. And Regent Park is one of the poorest neighborhood in Toronto. All the people who lived in Regent Park up until about 5 years ago were people who were on social assistance from the government. Carolyn looked around and recognized that all the staff who worked at Regent Park Community Center, but all the staff who worked in Regent Park came from outside Regent Park. $25 million a year went into services in the Regent Park, and most of that money left Regent Park because it went into salaries of folks who worked in the park. And Carolyn looked around and she thought, what is going to happen to this community if something doesn't change? And so Carolyn came up with a program called Pathways to Education, which started in Regent Park and which is now across the country. But Carolyn understood that if the cycle of poverty was going to be broken, education was a way into it. And if the community of Regent Park was going to be changed, it had to be changed by creating opportunities for the young kids, because 57% of the kids in Regent Park never completed high school. Right? So the system would just be perpetuated. So Carolyn introduced Pathways to Education, where every student for their high school got support with their studies. There were people who were identified to work with parents, and monies were raised that for every year a child successfully completed high school, $1,000 was set aside for their post high school education. It was great in theory. In practice, we found after the first cohort graduated from high school that if we gave them the money that had been set aside for their post-secondary education, their parents' rent would go up. And so it would defeat the purpose. And so we recognized at that point in time that if you were going to change the system, you had to advocate politically to make sure the space was created so this could happen. Today, one of the family doctors at the Regent Park Community Health Center is one of the first graduates of the Pathways to Education program. My point is this, and I think it's what Isaiah drives us to, is the recognition that the work of Christmas in attending to people who are excluded in the context of a time when there is no hope, transformation will happen when we take a communal perspective to it. Third story. A few years back, I was preaching on Black History Month, and I must confess, you see what I look like, and most times I'm not always often invited to preach. On Black History Month, I have to be saying, no, I'm not available. And in fact, while I was here this week, I've gotten several invites to preach in February, and I've had to say, no, my calendar is already booked up. But I said to the congregation I was preaching at that if you really want to be attentive to the issue of a racial divide in our country, then one of the things you need to do is to support Black businesses. Because investment in communities, restorers of the breach, is an important thing because community life, the communal life, is important. At the end of the service, several people came up to me and they said, where do you find out where Black businesses are? One of the people lives in a Black neighborhood where I could name at least 20 Black businesses in the area that they lived. They had not noticed. They had not noticed. Isaiah says, if we are attentive and if we understand that our engagement in the world is an integral part of what it means to worship. It is not part of our privilege. It's not part of our wealth. It's a fundamental part of what we claim as followers of the person called Jesus. And he says this, that if we recognize that, then we begin to understand that what we are called to do is to make communities safe and whole, and that we must have a communal perspective to the engagement of justice. That we need to keep a broad perspective on how we engage the world, because Isaiah tells us that when you do that, you create space and hope for generations. My brothers and sisters, as we move into this year, I encourage you, as Isaiah does, to keep a communal perspective, to engage in the work of justice that's about creating wholeness for communities of people, not just for individuals. And Isaiah tells us that when we do that, we would be like watered gardens, springs and desert. We will know that when we call on God, God will answer because we are about the business that God has called us to do. May God give us wisdom and courage to do it. Amen.
Thank you all. Sometimes we don't even plan for the song to work with the message, and the Spirit takes care of it for us. We come now to this celebration at the table. Communion. Communion is always a festival of friends, a pulling together of our loves and our hopes, our moments of agony, and our moments and glimpses of victory.
It is here where the bread is broken and the wine is shared that we can most fully be ourselves and see others for who they truly are, children of the living God.
And so here at this table, the common things of life, bread and cup, memories and dreams, become holy, touched by God.